What if I told you that the most brilliant mind in a Fortune 500 company was hiding in plain sight, emptying trash cans every single night? Today I'm sharing the incredible true story of how a janitor shocked an arrogant CEO by solving a puzzle that million-dollar AI systems couldn't crack. This man's hidden talents completely changed everything we thought we knew about intelligence and success. But before we dive in, I'm curious, what city are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you love stories that prove talent can be found anywhere, hit that subscribe button and let's uncover more hidden gems together. Tech Global Solutions dominated 3 entire floors of the city's most prestigious business district, its glass and steel structure piercing the skyline like a monument to corporate power. Behind walls of gleaming marble and floor-to-ceiling windows, the multinational corporation conducted deals worth hundreds of millions daily, orchestrating business across 6 continents with ruthless efficiency. Richard Blackwood, the 45-year-old CEO, ruled his corporate empire from the penthouse office with an iron fist and an ego that matched his company's towering headquarters. Harvard Business School educated and born into old Boston money, Richard possessed the kind of pedigree that opened doors before he even knocked. His great-grandfather had built railroads, his father had conquered Wall Street, and Richard himself had transformed a modest family investment firm into a global technology powerhouse. He firmly believed that success belonged exclusively to those with the right breeding, the proper education, and most importantly, the correct social connections that money could buy. His corner office sprawled across 1,500 square feet of prime real estate, offering panoramic views of the sprawling metropolis below. The walls displayed an impressive collection of gold-framed diplomas from Harvard, Wharton, and Oxford, interspersed with photographs showing Richard shaking hands with presidents, prime ministers, and Fortune 500 CEOs. Gleaming corporate awards lined custom-built shelves, each trophy representing another conquered market or crushed competitor. Richard wore exclusively $3,000 Italian suits tailored on Savile Row, paired with Swiss watches that cost more than most people's annual salary. To Richard, every employee occupied a specific, immutable rung on the corporate ladder, and that position was determined solely by education, family background, and bank account balance. He treated his staff with calculated precision. C-suite executives dined with him at exclusive country clubs, middle management received polite nods during elevator rides, and service workers remained practically invisible, existing only as necessary functions rather than human beings. This rigid hierarchy had served Richard exceptionally well throughout his meteoric career, reinforcing his unwavering belief that intelligence, capability, and worth were distributed according to social class and educational pedigree. Little did he know that his carefully constructed worldview, built over decades of privilege and reinforced by years of success, was about to crumble spectacularly, shattered by an encounter with someone he'd never bothered to truly see, the quiet night janitor who had been invisibly cleaning his office for over 5 years. Miguel Santos arrived at Tech Global every evening at exactly 6 p.m., his punctuality rivaling that of the Swiss timepieces adorning executive wrists. At 52 years old, his weathered hands told the story of 3 decades spent in manual labor, each callus and scar representing countless hours of honest work performed to support his family through jobs that others overlooked or dismissed. He moved through the corporate floors like a benevolent ghost, methodically emptying trash bins, mopping marble floors until they gleamed, and carefully dusting expensive furniture and electronic equipment while the building's supposedly important occupants had long since departed for their exclusive restaurants and private clubs. Miguel's uniform was simple but impeccably clean, navy blue coveralls bearing the Tech Global logo, practical rubber-soled shoes that squeaked softly against polished floors, and a tool belt containing the implements of his trade. His graying temples and laugh lines around his eyes suggested a man who had found contentment despite circumstances that might have embittered others. He hummed quietly while he worked, old folk songs from his homeland that his grandmother had taught him during childhood summers spent in her garden. What Richard and the other executives couldn't possibly know, because they had never bothered to engage Miguel in conversation beyond perfunctory nods, was that this humble janitor carried intellectual treasures far more valuable than any proprietary technology locked away in their corporate vaults. Born in a small village nestled in the mountains outside Guatemala City, Miguel had been the undisputed valedictorian of his high school class, earning perfect scores in mathematics, literature, and most remarkably, languages. His gift for linguistic patterns had manifested early, allowing him to master Spanish, English, and several indigenous Mayan dialects before his 18th birthday. A full academic scholarship had brought him to Guatemala's most prestigious university, where he studied comparative linguistics and ancient languages while working nights at a local newspaper to support his widowed mother and 3 younger siblings. His professors had marveled at his ability to decipher complex grammatical structures and decode dead languages that had puzzled scholars for centuries. Miguel's senior thesis on the linguistic connections between pre-Columbian civilizations had been selected for publication in an international archaeological journal, marking him as a rising star in academic circles. But political turmoil and economic collapse had shattered those promising beginnings like glass against stone. The crisis that would change everything began on a rainy Thursday evening in March, when Richard received an urgent call from Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the head curator of the Metropolitan Museum of Ancient History. The museum had acquired what appeared to be a revolutionary archaeological find, a perfectly preserved manuscript discovered in a recently excavated temple complex in southern Mexico. Carbon dating suggested the document was over 800 years old, predating European contact by centuries, yet its linguistic structure defied classification by the museum's entire team of experts. Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Hartwell's voice carried barely contained excitement through the speakerphone, this could rewrite our understanding of pre-Columbian civilization. The manuscript appears to contain advanced mathematical concepts, astronomical calculations, and what might be historical records of unprecedented detail. But here's the problem: nobody can translate it. We've consulted linguists from Harvard, Yale, the Smithsonian, even specialists from Mexico City and Guatemala. The writing system shares elements with known Mayan scripts, but incorporates symbols and grammatical structures we've never encountered. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, already sensing a business opportunity. Tech Global had recently acquired a small but innovative translation software company, and this high-profile project could provide exactly the kind of publicity needed to launch their new artificial intelligence language platform. Doctor, I think we can help each other. Our new AI translation system has been trained on thousands of ancient languages and dead scripts. Give me 48 hours. But 48 hours stretched into 2 weeks of frustration. Tech Global's most advanced algorithms, powered by quantum processors and neural networks that had cost millions to develop, produced nothing but gibberish when fed images of the mysterious manuscript. Richard's team of MIT and Stanford graduates worked around the clock, adjusting parameters and consulting databases, but the ancient text remained as impenetrable as a fortress wall. The failure stung Richard's pride like a physical blow. Tech Global had built its reputation on solving impossible problems, on applying cutting-edge technology where others had failed. Major clients were beginning to ask questions, competitors were circling like vultures, and the tech blogs that had once praised Richard's innovations were now speculating about Tech Global's limitations. The manuscript had become more than just a translation project. It was a test of everything Richard believed about the supremacy of modern technology and elite education over primitive mysteries and ancient wisdom. Friday afternoon brought the weekly executive meeting, where Richard's frustration finally boiled over into the kind of arrogant display that would later haunt his dreams. Gathered around the polished conference table were Tech Global's brightest minds: Harvard MBAs, MIT engineers, Stanford computer scientists, and Wharton financial analysts. Each possessed credentials that opened doors across Silicon Valley, yet collectively they had been defeated by symbols carved into stone by people who had lived before the invention of gunpowder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he gestured toward the high-resolution photographs of the manuscript projected on the wall-mounted screens, "we have been outsmarted by people who didn't even have the wheel. Our multi-million-dollar AI system, trained on every known language database in existence, has been reduced to producing random character strings by some jungle scribblings from the Dark Ages." The executives shifted uncomfortably in their ergonomic chairs, sensing their bosses mounting frustration but unsure how to respond. Sarah Chen, the head of software development and a graduate of both MIT and Harvard Business School, tentatively raised her hand. "Perhaps we need more time to refine the neural network parameters, or maybe we should consider bringing in additional specialists from—" Richard cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Specialists? We are the specialists. We have the most advanced translation technology on the planet, operated by the most educated minds money can buy. If we can't crack this puzzle, then nobody can." His eyes gleamed with the dangerous light that his employees had learned to fear. "In fact, I'm so confident that this manuscript is beyond human comprehension that I'm willing to make a wager. I'll pay anyone in this building, anyone, a full year's salary if they can provide even a partial translation of this document." The challenge hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Richard's assistant quickly calculated the stakes. His annual salary alone exceeded $2 million, while the average Tech Global employee earned between $60,000 and $300,000 depending on their position. The executives exchanged glances, some considering whether to accept the challenge themselves, others wondering if their boss had finally lost his mind under the pressure of this very public failure. But Richard wasn't finished. Standing from his chair and pacing to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, he continued his rant with growing intensity. You know what the real problem is here? We've become so obsessed with diversity and inclusion that we've forgotten merit is what matters. We've got janitors and maintenance workers wandering these halls, people who barely speak English properly, and somehow we're supposed to pretend they're just as capable as our PhD researchers. His voice rose to address the entire floor through the conference room's open door. I'll tell you what, I'll extend this challenge to everyone. Janitors, security guards, cafeteria workers. I don't care who you are or where you came from. Translate even one sentence of this manuscript, and I'll personally write you a check for a year of my salary. Miguel had been emptying wastebaskets in the adjacent hallway when Richard's voice began echoing through the building's open-plan architecture. Like most of Tech Global's service workers, he had developed the ability to become functionally invisible while still performing his duties efficiently. Executives conducted sensitive phone calls in his presence as if he were a piece of furniture, middle managers discussed confidential projects while he cleaned around their desks, and administrative assistants gossiped about office politics without ever considering that the quiet man with the mop might understand every word. But as Richard's challenge reverberated through the corporate corridors, Miguel felt something stirring in his chest. A familiar tingling sensation he hadn't experienced since his university days when professors would present particularly challenging linguistic puzzles. He approached the conference room slowly, ostensibly to empty the trash bin near the entrance, but in reality drawn by an intellectual curiosity that 25 years of menial labor hadn't managed to extinguish completely. From his position near the doorway, Miguel could clearly see the manuscript images displayed on the conference room's enormous screens. What he observed made his heart race with recognition and excitement. The symbols weren't completely unfamiliar to him. In fact, they bore striking similarities to an ancient dialect he had studied during his university research, a rare variant of classical Mayan that incorporated elements from several other pre-Columbian writing systems. This wasn't just any historical document. Based on the symbol patterns and structural elements he could identify, this appeared to be written in a scholarly language that had been used exclusively by priest-scribes in certain highland temples. Miguel's grandmother had been a keeper of old traditions in their mountain village, and she had taught him fragments of this ancient tongue during long summer evenings when he was a child. What she had passed down orally, he had later studied academically, writing his thesis on the connections between various indigenous languages and their evolution over centuries of cultural interaction. The symbols on that screen represented a linguistic puzzle he had been uniquely prepared to solve through a combination of formal education and traditional cultural knowledge that no Ivy League university could replicate. As Richard continued his mocking tirade about the supposed impossibility of translating the document, Miguel quietly observed the manuscript structure and began identifying key linguistic markers. He could see repeated symbol clusters that likely represented common words or grammatical particles, structural patterns that suggested verb conjugations, and numerical systems that aligned with advanced Mayan mathematical concepts he had studied extensively. This wasn't an indecipherable mystery. It was a sophisticated but comprehensible text written by highly educated ancient scholars who had developed their own scholarly shorthand for complex ideas. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Miguel. Here was Richard Blackwood, Harvard MBA and self-proclaimed master of the universe, publicly declaring that a document was beyond human comprehension, while the solution stood 20 feet away wearing a janitor's uniform and carrying a mop bucket. For 5 years, Miguel had cleaned this man's office, emptied his trash, and polished his furniture while being treated as if he possessed the intelligence of the cleaning supplies he carried. But unlike Richard, Miguel understood that true knowledge couldn't be measured by the prestige of one's university or the cost of one's suit. Miguel spent the weekend studying photocopied images of the manuscript that he had discreetly obtained from the museum's public research database. Working at his kitchen table in his modest apartment, surrounded by reference books he had accumulated over decades and notebooks filled with his careful handwriting, he began the painstaking process of translation. His wife Maria watched with growing excitement as symbols and meanings began falling into place under her husband's careful analysis, like pieces of a complex puzzle finally revealing their intended picture. "Corrito," Maria said softly, placing a cup of coffee beside his scattered papers. "This is what you were meant to do. I haven't seen you this alive since we left Guatemala." She had been his strongest supporter through 25 years of financial struggle and professional frustration, working double shifts at a textile factory while he took whatever employment he could find. She understood better than anyone the sacrifice he had made, abandoning his academic dreams to provide security for their 3 children who were now successful professionals themselves: a doctor, an engineer, and a teacher who had all benefited from their parents' sacrifices. By Sunday evening, Miguel had completed a rough translation of approximately 60% of the manuscript. What he discovered took his breath away. This wasn't merely a historical record or religious text. It was a sophisticated astronomical and mathematical treatise that demonstrated the ancient Maya had achieved scientific understanding that wouldn't be matched in Europe for several more centuries. The document contained precise calculations of planetary movements, complex geometric theorems, and detailed observations of solar and lunar eclipses that were accurate to within minutes of modern calculations. The scientific implications were staggering, but Miguel found himself facing a personal dilemma that transcended academic discovery. Revealing his abilities would inevitably lead to questions about his background, his education, and his reasons for working as a janitor despite possessing rare and valuable expertise. He had spent years carefully maintaining a low profile, avoiding situations that might draw unwanted attention to his immigration status or complicated personal history. Even though he had eventually obtained legal residency and then citizenship, the habit of invisibility had become deeply ingrained. But as Monday morning approached, Miguel realized he faced a choice that would define not just his own future, but potentially the way his children and grandchildren would remember their father and grandfather. He could remain safely invisible, continuing to clean offices and empty trash cans while extraordinary opportunities passed him by, or he could step forward and claim the respect and recognition that his knowledge and abilities deserved. The manuscript had become a bridge between his past and his potential future, a test of whether he still possessed the courage that had once carried him across international borders in search of better opportunities. Maria's words echoed in his mind as he prepared for work Monday evening. "You've spent 25 years making yourself smaller so others could feel bigger. Maybe it's time to remind the world who you really are." Tuesday morning arrived with unusual tension in the Tech Global offices. Richard's public challenge had become the talk of the company, with employees speculating about whether anyone would be bold enough to attempt the translation and risk the humiliation of failure in front of the notoriously demanding CEO. The manuscript images had been posted on the company's internal network, allowing everyone access to the puzzle that had stumped the most sophisticated artificial intelligence systems money could buy. Miguel arrived for his evening shift carrying a manila envelope containing 23 pages of handwritten analysis, translation, and supporting documentation. His hands trembled slightly as he approached Richard's executive suite, where the CEO was working late on quarterly financial reports. Through the glass walls, Miguel could see Richard hunched over his computer, surrounded by the trappings of corporate success that no longer seemed quite as intimidating as they had just days earlier. Taking a deep breath that carried the weight of 25 years of silence, Miguel knocked on the door frame. Richard looked up with barely concealed irritation at the interruption, his expression shifting from annoyance to confused surprise when he realized his visitor was the night janitor whose name he had never bothered to learn. "Sir," Miguel began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I believe I can help you with a manuscript translation." He spoke in clear, unaccented English that immediately caught Richard's attention. This wasn't the broken, hesitant speech that Richard associated with service workers, but the confident diction of someone who had spent years in academic environments. Richard's first reaction was dismissive laughter. "Look, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but this document has stumped linguistics professors from Harvard, Yale, and the Smithsonian. Our AI system, which cost more than most people make in a lifetime, can't even identify the language family. I think it's a little beyond." He paused, realizing he didn't actually know the janitor's name. "Miguel Santos," Miguel supplied quietly. "And with respect, sir, your AI system failed because it was searching through the wrong databases. This manuscript isn't written in a mainstream Mayan dialect that would be found in standard academic collections. It's composed in a specialized scholarly variant that was used exclusively by priest astronomers in certain highland temple complexes, primarily during the late classical period." The casual expertise in Miguel's explanation stopped Richard mid-sentence. This wasn't the response he had expected from someone whose entire job description involved emptying trash and mopping floors. There was something in Miguel's tone and terminology that suggested depths Richard had never suspected existed beneath the humble exterior of the building's night janitor. "You're saying you can read this?" Richard asked, his voice beginning to carry a note of uncertainty that his employees rarely heard. Miguel opened his envelope and spread his translation across Richard's polished desk. The opening passage reads, "In the year of the falling stars, when the great conjunction brought darkness at midday, the priest-scribes of the sacred mountain gathered to record the movements of the celestial serpents for future generations who would inherit the burden of knowledge." He looked up to meet Richard's stunned gaze. "It's an astronomical treatise, Mr. Blackwood. These ancient scholars were recording planetary movements and eclipse calculations with extraordinary precision." The silence in Richard's office stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. The CEO of Tech Global Solutions, Harvard Business School graduate and supposed master of the corporate universe, stared at pages of handwritten translation that represented everything his worldview said should be impossible. Here was a man he had dismissed as intellectually inferior, someone whose existence barely registered in his consciousness, presenting sophisticated academic analysis that his million-dollar technology and Ivy League experts had failed to produce. Richard picked up the translation with hands that weren't quite steady, scanning Miguel's careful handwriting and detailed annotations. The work was meticulous, scholarly, and utterly convincing. Cross-references to known Mayan mathematical systems, comparisons with other pre-Columbian texts, and explanations of linguistic variations demonstrated a level of expertise that Richard couldn't question, despite his overwhelming desire to find some flaw that would preserve his comfortable assumptions about merit and intelligence. This is remarkable work," Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you learn to read ancient Mayan dialects?" The question carried the weight of a man whose fundamental beliefs about the world were crumbling in real time. Miguel straightened in his chair, decades of forced humility finally giving way to quiet dignity. "I was a linguistics professor at the Universidad de San Carlos in Guatemala before political circumstances forced me to leave my country. I specialized in pre-Columbian languages and wrote my doctoral dissertation on the evolutionary connections between various indigenous writing systems. What you're seeing isn't just academic training. It's also knowledge passed down through my family, oral traditions that have been preserved in highland communities for generations." The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. For 5 years, this man had cleaned his office, handled his waste, and maintained the physical space where Richard conducted business worth millions of dollars. 5 years of being treated as invisible, of being dismissed as intellectually inferior, of being relegated to the lowest rung of the corporate hierarchy despite possessing rare and valuable expertise that Richard's entire company had been unable to replicate. "Dr. Santos," Richard said, the title feeling strange on his tongue but somehow necessary, "I owe you an apology that goes far deeper than this translation project. I've been blind to talents and capabilities that were right in front of me, and that blindness is entirely my fault." He reached for his checkbook, hands still trembling slightly. "A promise is a promise. My annual salary is $2.3 million, and you've more than earned it." Miguel looked at the check Richard was writing, but his expression remained thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't need your salary. What I need is the opportunity to use my knowledge and abilities in work that matters. I've spent 25 years being invisible, and I'm tired of hiding who I really am." 6 months later, Dr. Miguel Santos had become Tech Global's Director of Cultural and Linguistic Research, leading a team that specialized in bridging traditional knowledge with modern technology. The ancient manuscript translation had opened doors to partnerships with museums, universities, and cultural institutions worldwide. Richard still served as CEO, but he had learned to listen more carefully to voices he had previously ignored, and to question assumptions about intelligence and worth that had once seemed unshakable. The janitor's closet on the 22nd floor was now occupied by someone new, but Miguel kept a small photo on his office desk, a picture of himself in his old uniform, holding his mop and bucket. It served as a daily reminder that brilliance often hides in unexpected places, and that true wisdom lies not in dismissing others, but in remaining humble enough to recognize that everyone has something valuable to teach. The story of Tech Global's most important discovery wasn't really about an ancient manuscript or a corporate challenge. It was about the danger of making assumptions, the cost of arrogance, and the transformative power of finally seeing people as they truly are rather than as we expect them to be.